Layer 5, the session layer. Now, layer 5 is our session layer, and we want to start thinking about what a session is. The way I like to think about a session is that it's a conversation that has to be kept separate from all of the others to prevent the intermingling of data. Now, if you think about yourself in a classroom setting, we might have 20 students sitting here. Now, if I wanted to ask a question to one student only, everyone else can listen to it. Maybe you want to take that student and we're going to go walk out into the hallway so we can have our own session, our own private conversation, while all of the other 19 students can talk among themselves and they're having their own session. That way we can separate these two sessions apart and each of us can talk at the same time without interfering with the other. Me and my student out in the hall and all the other 19 students sitting back in the classroom. Now that's the idea here when we talk about the session layer. We have all sorts of data flying around our networks all day long. And by establishing these sessions, we can separate them to prevent the intermingling or cross-contamination of that data. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a session, we're going to maintain a session, and we're going to tear down a session here inside the session layer. Now, what is setting up a session? This is where we're going to check our user credentials, and we're going to assign a number to the session to help identify it. It's basically some random number that's going to allow us to negotiate services for that session with the server and then negotiate who's going to talk first, either the server or myself. Now let's go back to our classroom setting once more. If Johnny asks me a question, he says, "Hey, Professor Dion," I'll say, "Yes, Johnny," and then guess what? We're going to start talking because we've established that session. I know that Johnny wants to talk to me and Johnny knows that I'm ready to talk to him. Now I know who he is, he knows who I am, and we both know what each other wants. We want to start talking. In a computer network, it's a little bit more difficult, but that's really the idea behind it when we start talking about a session. Now, the next thing we have to do is we have to maintain this session. This is where we're going to transfer data back and forth across the network over and over and over again. Going back to my classroom example, if Johnny asked me a question, I'd say, "Yes, go ahead and ask the question, Johnny." And then Johnny's going to ask his question. And at this point, we're maintaining a session. So here we are going back and forth, where I can answer their question and see if I can answer everything they have for me, right? Well, the same idea happens here inside our networks. Now that the session has been established, we're going to send all of our data back and forth over and over again. Now, if we have a break in the connection, we're going to have to reestablish our connection. So for instance, I might say, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Johnny. Can you repeat your question?" Again, I'm maintaining that session, so that way I get what they want to tell me, and then I can answer them. Now also, I'm going to acknowledge the receipt of the data. I'll say, "Did you understand my answer, Johnny?" And they'll say, "Yeah, I did," or "No, I didn't." And if they did, they'll acknowledge the receipt. If they didn't, they're going to tell me, "No, I didn't understand. Can you tell me that again a different way?" Well, the same thing happens digitally with your networks. And that brings us to the final area, tearing down a session. So now that the student's question has been answered in our analogy of the classroom, I'll say, "Johnny, does that answer your question?" And hopefully he'll say, "Yes, it does." And at that point I'll say, "Okay, we're going to move on to the next thing in the course." And as I say that, we're going to move on to the next question. That tears down the session. The session between me and Johnny is done, and I'm going to go back to teaching. And if Johnny has another question, he's got to raise his hand again so that I can go and say, "Okay, Johnny, what's your question?" And we'll start a new session, right? That would be the end of that particular session once I answer his question and got confirmation that he has it. Then we can move on. Now this is done based on this mutual agreement. Once we've transferred all the data back and forth we wanted to, we're going to verify that I'm ready to tear down the session, you're ready for the session to be torn down, and then we can tear down that session. The other way we could take down a session is if one of the parties disconnects and we simply can't reconnect to them. For instance, let's go back to my classroom example. Johnny asked a question. I go on a 30-minute diatribe trying to explain every possible thing to answer his question. And I look up and guess what? Johnny has his head down on the table and he's fallen asleep. I bored him to death. There's no way for me to maintain that session because he's not getting the information. He's completely asleep. He is dead asleep and he is not listening anymore. Well, he has disconnected from this conversation and therefore I can't re-engage. So I'm just going to stop teaching and move on to other students who are awake and are paying attention and actually have questions for me. That's the idea here with tearing down a session. This can be done either mutually, where we both have finished the communication and we say, "Yep, I'm done, you're done, we understand each other," we move on, or the other party simply disappears, in which case I want to free up my resources so I can go help other people again, and that's what I would do as a computer. So what are some examples of layer 5 devices or protocols or things that you should associate with layer 5? Well, the two big ones are H.323 and NetBIOS. Let's talk about H.323 first. H.323 is used to set up, maintain, and tear down voice and video connections. If you're using FaceTime or Skype or something like that, you're probably using something like H.323, which operates over the RTP or real-time protocol. Now I know I just threw out a lot of acronyms for you. For the exam, if you see something like H.323 or H.264, I want you to think about streaming audio or streaming video, something like FaceTime, Skype, YouTube, video teleconference, something like that. These operate over the real-time protocol known as RTP. Anytime you see RTP, I want you to think about streaming audio or streaming video, generally in a two-way format like a phone call or a FaceTime session. Keep those in your head and you're going to do great on the exam because they do like to throw those in and I want you to see those. Now, the second thing I mentioned is that we have something known as NetBIOS. Now, NetBIOS is used by computers to share files over a network. Windows uses this as the method of its file sharing as well inside, so you're going to see it a lot on your networks. Now, again, when we talk about layer 5 devices, there's really not a device necessarily, but it's more these protocols and software. So if you see something like H.323, RTP, or NetBIOS, I want you to remember these are all layer 5 issues.